Muslims often note that there is a tendency, whether in academic circles or public discussions, to ignore the significant contributions that Islamic civilizations made to Europe during the so-called Dark Ages. This neglect often stems from a misinterpretation of the role of Islam, with some attributing the backwardness of Islamic societies to the religion itself. Such perspectives often equate Islam with the Western historical experiences with the Church before the Enlightenment, without acknowledging the profound impact that Islamic civilization had on the development of Western societies. In this enlightening video, Dr. Diana Darke, a British historian and expert on Middle Eastern culture, delves into the remarkable advances that Muslims made in Europe. In various scientific fields, her research has shed light on the pivotal role that these contributions played in shaping contemporary European civilization.
Damascus was the first capital of the first Islamic dynasty, the Umayyads. So when the Umayyads conquered Damascus in 634, they obviously inherited what was there before. And so that was Christian buildings, Christian styles. And it's worth mentioning, actually, too, that for the first nearly 100 years, Christians and Muslims actually shared the site. The site itself, right in the heart of the old city, has always been the sort of spiritual center of Syria. That same site was shared by Christians and Muslims, and they even entered through the same main entrance. Christians turned one way, Muslims turned the other. And it was only when the population outgrew that space and the Muslims needed more space, and this is recorded in the contemporary historical records, that they compensated the Christians and said, right, we need to take over this space now and build a new mosque for our growing community. And in compensation, we'll give you the sites for 4 churches where you can go and build new churches there. And so to this day, you know, there are 17 different churches in Syria, different denominations, and the church bells ring out on a Sunday and blend with the call to prayer. It's one of those wonderful things I used to hear sitting in my courtyard house, you know, every Sunday. And of course, when they did decide to build that mosque then, so it was built around about 705 to 715, to the very early 8th century. Of course, at that time, the top builders were Christians because, you know, they were used to the local building materials, the local limestone. And so Christian builders were brought, probably with some Muslims as well, to create this new mosque. And it's blended. When you look at it, you can just see that it's blended. It's combining all those elements that were there before. And then one of the minarets is called the Jesus minaret, because that's where, according to local tradition, Christ will descend on the final day of judgment. It's very typical of the sort of blending of Christian and Muslim traditions in Syria. You know, there's people forget that Mary gets more mentions in the Quran than she does in the New Testament. You know, Mary is a very important figure in the Quran, and so many of the biblical stories feature in the Quran. And so the mosaics, which are one of the famous things about the Umayyad Mosque, mosaic art was a top Byzantine speciality. So that's not a field that Muslims ever excelled in. The best were always the Byzantine Christians at that. But now, of course, they're working for new Muslim masters. So instead of doing their usual mosaics of saints and biblical stories, you know, they're doing instead an imagined Islamic paradise with trees and gardens and rivers and some fantasized buildings. So this is one of the interesting things that I focus on in my new book, Islamesque, you know, that, okay, we can recognize all of that in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. We can see that the Christians made a big contribution to that mosque, except that they're now working for new Muslim masters. The same thing happened then, and this is what's so little recognized and what I try to draw attention to. So when the Umayyads were kicked out of Syria, and the one Umayyad prince who survived Abdurrahman makes his way across North Africa and sets up Umayyad Spain. Syria in Spain is what they set up then in the 8th century. They take all of that with them into Spain, and they are so much more advanced than the European culture there. They're 2 centuries ahead. And again, you can see that in the buildings. Yes. So the Cordoba Mesquita, the main mosque of Cordoba, so Cordoba is the equivalent of Damascus, but in Spain. The Cordoba Mesquita is the equivalent of the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. It's modelled on it directly. The same measurements, the same everything. Now, it's been extended in subsequent centuries in a way that the Damascus Umayyad Mosque has not. And with each extension, all of the top innovations from the Muslim world, the understanding of geometry, of algebra, this, we're talking the peak Islamic civilization in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. This is the time when the Muslim civilization in Baghdad was, as I said, 2 centuries ahead of anything that was going on in Europe. And they brought all of that into the Cordoba Mesquita, into this very sophisticated civilization there in Spain. And the dome in front of the mihrab in the Cordoba Mesquita has got very early 10th century ribbed vaulting. This is how you hold up a dome made of stone, not of wood. So you need to be able to distribute the weight correctly. It's very, very advanced level of geometry you need for that, which did not exist in Europe at that time.
Yeah.
And then, you see, when it's a very long time, but during the gradual Christian reconquest of Spain, the Reconquista, as they call it, of course, new Christian masters are coming in, and the Islamic civilization is on the decline, and the Christian civilization is on the way up. But those Christian new rulers, the new bishops, the new abbots, they want the best in their churches and monasteries, and so the best are the Muslims. Same, exactly the mirror situation of how it was back in Syria. When the Muslims first took over, they went to the Christians, who were the top elite people. But the role was reversed. And there's a reluctance to recognize that in Europe, that somehow when you look at the architectural history books, they talk about, around the year 1100, this miracle happened, and there was this amazing burst of innovation in churches and cathedrals and monasteries. These wonderful styles came in, and they call it Romanesque. And that's what I'm saying here. Look, hang on a minute. Look at it, look at it closely, because actually the timing, the techniques themselves, even the decorative repertoire, everything is what was brought in from the Islamic world. And then, because they're now working for new Christian masters, it comes in to churches and cathedrals. And that's what I'm proving in the book Islamesque. So Islamesque is a word I've made up for the 21st century in direct challenge of this term Romanesque. And Romanesque is regarded as the first pan-European style, which leads on to Gothic, which then leads on to the Renaissance. So they're saying, Romanesque is the essential springboard for the whole of what then happens in European civilization, the flourishing in the Renaissance. And I'm saying, look, that springboard was Islamesque. These are the things that enabled Europe to make these future leaps in the following centuries. And that needs to be recognized. And what's more, you can train your eye to see it in the buildings. And that's my point, that the evidence is the buildings themselves. Huh. The crazy thing is that the term Romanesque was only invented in the 19th century anyway by a pair of French art historians writing to each other, so in correspondence. It's a made-up term, but it's kind of stuck, rather like Gothic. I mean, the term Gothic was only invented in the 16th century by an Italian art critic. And yet we now, in the West are besotted with these terms that we can't shed, and I think that needs shaking up. This this way of looking at it, that this is Romanesque and then that led to Gothic. these terms are nonsensical. They're completely nonsensical, because the way it's described, that then by some miracle Gothic architecture was born at this basilica in Paris, Saint-Denis. And you read any art history book, and this is what it will tell you. The birth of Gothic took place there in that basilica. And I'm saying, look, sorry, you don't just miraculously, like some sort of virgin birth, a building doesn't just pop out like that. There's a massive backstory that needs to be understood. And I'm highlighting that backstory and showing how it got to that point and where all those innovations came from. Okay. The timing fits perfectly with when Muslims dominated the construction industry in Muslim Spain and in Sicily. Don't forget, the Fatimids were in Sicily for 300 years. And then the Normans conquered Sicily and took a lot of those styles then, and indeed the craftsmen, back into France and then into this country. And what gets called Norman architecture in this country is Romanesque. Norman and Romanesque are the same thing for an art historian. So they talk about Norman architecture, they mean Romanesque architecture. It is one and the same, because it was the Normans who brought it here to Britain. So that's the way it's portrayed. But, I'm saying, look, all of that needs to be challenged, because you're not explaining where these things came from.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you admire the content.
And this is where actually we come back to my courtyard house, because the thing that provided me with my eureka moment for Islamesque is the zigzag, the pattern of the zigzag. And in my house in Damascus, there's a trio of zigzags, a pattern running all the way around the courtyard. And I could never understand what it was. And I asked my Syrian architect friends, and they said, well, we don't know. We assume it's some sort of ancient archetypal pattern of some sort, some Mesopotamian thing or whatever. But nobody could ever answer me that question. But I was always sure there was something. These things are never random. In architecture, whatever is chosen as a shape is deliberate. It's a deliberate choice. And then by chance, because actually my brother recommended it, I watched this documentary called The Secret History of Writing. And it starts off showing the presenter climbing up to a turquoise mine in the Sinai Peninsula. And on a hieroglyphic pillar, there is the hieroglyph for water is a zigzag. And that then comes into the early Canaanite, the very earliest phonetic alphabet, where they take the zigzag and it becomes the sound of m for water, like mai is Arabic for water, mai or may, various dialect versions always beginning with the M. And if you think about it, even our letter M in English is a little zigzag too. And so as soon as I saw that, I realized, my goodness, that's it. My zigzag in my courtyard is water flowing around, it's abstract, representing water, but it's traceable all the way back to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. I mean, you go to any Romanesque or Gothic church, and you'll find zigzags around the arches. Anything that's called Norman will have zigzags there. But it's not been recognized as where it came from. So that was my clue. It starts with a zigzag. I even call the first chapter the zigzag clue. Yes. And then from that, I think, okay, what if zigzags are just the tip of the iceberg? What if this applies to everything that they're calling Romanesque? So one by one, I go through the features of Romanesque and I show where it's all come from. And without fail, it leads back, often via North Africa, places like Kairouan, very important, very advanced civilization, the Aghlabids, who were there before the Fatimids, so this is very, very early. So in 10th century castles in ribats, as they're called, in North Africa, there's a a pattern like that often occurs along the top of the wall. It's purely decorative. It's not serving any structural purpose. But that then appears in European cathedrals, and it gets called Venetian dental. And then Europeans just accept that. This is a European invention, and it's Venetian dental. End of story. Nobody questions where it all came from. So what I'm doing in this is like a sort of huge piece of detective work. And what's so great about that is you train your eye. The more cathedrals I've been to visit, the more I see it. It's just your eye gets better and better at it. So you start to recognize every little aspect, the use of what are called quatrefoil arches. So the cloisters in cathedrals like that with very slender columns. Yeah. All of that is an Islamic aesthetic. And just to give you a sense of how advanced the Muslim skills were there, that dome I mentioned above the Cordova Mesquita, the very earliest ribbed vault, that 10th century we're talking there, that was examined by Spanish structural engineers, and they wrote a report on it, and they were just flabbergasted by what they found. They said, we have never seen anything with such astonishing geometric perfection. And in its entire more than 1,000 years of existence, it has never needed a structural repair. This is the level of craftsmanship we're talking about there. I was taught that that civilization was European. Right. End of story. Greece and Rome, that was it. That was civilization. There was no acknowledgement of where the Greeks got anything from, where the Romans got anything from. And so I grew up with a very Eurocentric viewpoint of Europe being the center of everything, really. And so it was only when I then switched to study Arabic at university and started to go to the Middle East myself that I realized, my goodness, this is where the Greeks got most of their stuff. It goes further back than I've ever realized before. And then, of course, as I spent time in countries like Syria and Palestine and Egypt, because I lived in these places for quite a long time, and I just began to notice how much has been, taken, all those similarities, really, which I think it's important to acknowledge. As I said, I think it enhances your appreciation of things like buildings and cultures if you can recognize the many layers behind it all. So when I look at a cathedral facade now, and I can see immediately, okay, so they've got that little double window thing that's the style which is taken directly from Muslim Spain. Yes. The trio of pointed arches at the bottom, the use of pearl beaded framing, which is most definitely an Islamic thing, which has come into use in cathedrals. And that's it. Once you see it, it is actually hiding in plain sight. It's right there in the buildings. The buildings speak for themselves. Architecture doesn't lie. It's there, a historical record. It's not a document, but it's a record that tells you exactly what happened and where all the influences came from. The other fields in Islamic Spain, for instance, and as I mentioned, the Arabs were there for 800 years, nearly a very long time, So the influences, apart from the architectural things, the other areas where Muslims dominated were carpentry and metalworking, the use agriculture and use of water wheels, so very, very much more advanced irrigation systems. So in Spain, for instance, there before the Arabs arrived, there was only one harvest a year. Once the Arabs brought in their new techniques, their new irrigation techniques, water management, there were 3 to 4 harvests a year. So, of course, the productivity was suddenly way, way up, and of course they brought in all the different types of food that we now take for granted, oranges and lemons and pomegranates and dates and apricots, so many things that we now just think of as normal when you actually go back and this kind of thing has been studied and analysed by American academics like Thomas Glick and Brian Catlos. Those are the two who've really studied Islamic Spain in detail to look at the top areas that were dominated by Muslims because they were very skilled. So textiles was another one. Huge ability with silk and the manufacture of luxury end textiles. And sometimes they even had Kufic writing written on the hems because the bishops thought that this was the language of Christ. They thought it was holy writing. So they had it, on the hems of their beautiful gowns and things, So again, going to Muslim Spain, and this is all documented. So at that time, 8th, 9th, 10th century, when Islamic Spain, the Caliphate of Cordova, was at its peak in the 10th century. And at that time, the Caliph, had huge libraries with I think it was 400,000 books. And paper, by the way, was brought in from, the Arabs didn't invent it, it was invented in China, but it was then used in Baghdad, and the Arabs, via Muslim Spain, brought paper into Europe. So, Europe was behind in all of that. The place of learning was Islamic Spain and the Islamic world. They held the key for all this knowledge, the scientific knowledge, the medical knowledge, the philosophical knowledge. There was so much that came in via the Islamic world, but especially the scientific mathematical side of things.
Would you go back then to your house in Damascus?
Most definitely now, with what's happened. I will most definitely go back. Most definitely for the research and in order to see all my Syrian friends whom I'm still very much in touch with. And I should say that they're people from all walks of life, different religions, different backgrounds. And that's what's so wonderful about Syria, that, I've got Muslim friends, Alawi friends, Druze friends, Ismaili friends, and Christian friends. And of course, the Christian friends, people have to remember, are not just from one group of Christians. Syria's got 17, I think it is, different denominations of Christianity. It's a very complex picture, but people historically have reveled in that diversity. And that is what I love about Syria.
Do you have any anxieties with regards to the new administration in Syria?
No, none whatever. From everything I've seen, I think this, all this sort of, this worry about, these Al-Qaeda links and everything are very much magnified by a Western perception of these things. But from what I've seen, and from what all my Syrian friends tell me as well, but also instinctively, the way I've watched Jawlani for a while, what he was doing in Idlib, and now as Ahmed Ashara, I see the same things. He, in fact, more so. He, I think, is committed to a pluralistic Syria. He will take a pragmatic approach. He doesn't expect everybody to have exactly the same religious beliefs as him. He recognizes that Syria is a diverse place, and there needs to be a place for all of those different people with their different religions. And one of the beauties of Syria used to be that people didn't even think about, what sect are you? People didn't even know. They're all mixed together in the same classroom at school. Yeah. So they were friends, Muslims and Christians were friends.